The accusation and the tension begins. The autumn sun was shining brilliantly that afternoon as Mia Collins stepped off the city bus, her heart light with anticipation. At 18, Mia was a young woman of quiet confidence and kindness, with a spark in her eye that lit up anyone's day. Today, that spark was especially bright. She was on a mission to buy her mom the perfect birthday gift. Her mother's taste was refined and understated, but Mia knew that her favorite color was a deep sapphire blue. She imagined a piece of jewelry as timeless as her mother's grace, something that would make her mom's face light up the moment she opened it. As Mia walked down the crowded city streets, she kept her pace brisk, scanning the shop windows for something that would catch her eye. After passing by a few boutiques and deciding they didn't quite have what she was looking for, she finally found herself in front of Lansbury Jewelers, a high-end store with a reputation for exquisite pieces and an air of exclusivity. The store's window displayed an array of glittering jewelry, each piece carefully arranged to capture the sunlight streaming in. Maya felt a momentary hesitation as she looked inside. It was the kind of place she knew people came to when they wanted to spend thousands, not the modest amount she had saved from her summer job. But undeterred by the store's luxury feel, Maya took a deep breath and walked in, her mind set on finding something special for her mother. Inside, the store was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the noisy streets outside. The faint sound of classical music played over the speakers, adding to the store's elegant ambience. Mia's eyes wandered across the displays of necklaces, rings, and bracelets, each piece more beautiful than the last. She felt a flutter of excitement. Her mother was going to love this gift. "Good afternoon," a voice called softly from behind a glass display. Maya looked up to see a saleswoman in her 50s with a warm smile. Her name tag read Evelyn. "Can I help you find something today?" "Yes, thank you," Maya replied, relieved by Evelyn's friendliness. "I'm looking for a birthday gift for my mom. She loves blue, and I was hoping to find something with a sapphire or something similar." Evelyn's smile grew as she led Mia to a display case near the back of the store. "I think I might have just what you're looking for," she said, pulling out a delicate silver chain with a sapphire pendant nestled in its center. The stone was vibrant, with a depth of color that caught Mia's eye immediately. As Mia held the necklace, her fingers brushed over the cool, smooth stone, and she couldn't help but picture her mother's reaction. It was perfect. But just as she was admiring it, she noticed something strange. A tall, elegantly dressed woman with sharp features and perfectly styled hair was standing near the entrance, watching her intently. The woman's gaze was not friendly. Her eyes were narrow, assessing, as if Mia's presence in the store was somehow wrong. Mia tried to ignore it, reminding herself that she belonged here as much as anyone else. She was a customer, just like everyone else. But her unease grew when she saw the woman whisper something to another employee, who glanced over at Mia with a similar expression of disdain. Mia's cheeks flushed. She was no stranger to the looks and whispers that came with being different. Her father, a prominent FBI agent, had always taught her that people could be quick to judge. But this felt different. It felt targeted. Trying to shake off the discomfort, Mia turned back to Evelyn. "I think I'd like to get this one," she said, offering a small smile, though her fingers trembled slightly as she handed back the necklace. But before Evelyn could even reach out to take it, the woman with the cold gaze, whom Mia would later learn was Mrs. Hampton, the store owner, stepped forward. Her face was set in a look of quiet but unmistakable accusation. "Excuse me, young lady," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Could you please empty your pockets?" Mia's heart dropped. The calm, serene environment of the jewelry store suddenly felt suffocating, like she was trapped. Her eyes widened as she looked from Mrs. Hampton to Evelyn, who stood frozen, looking just as shocked as Mia felt. "I'm sorry," Mia stammered, caught completely off guard. Her hands instinctively clutched her small handbag, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment as she sensed the eyes of other shoppers turning toward her. "I've been watching you," Mrs. Hampton continued, her voice low and cutting. You've been handling quite a few items. We have very valuable pieces in this store, and we can't take any chances. But I didn't take anything, Maya replied, her voice barely a whisper. She could feel her chest tightening as panic began to set in. She was aware of the sudden quiet around her, the way people were starting to murmur and look her way. Mrs. Hampton's expression didn't soften. That's what they all say, she remarked coldly. If you have nothing to hide, then you won't mind emptying your pockets. Mia's hands trembled as she felt a wave of anger and humiliation wash over her. How could this woman accuse her so easily? She was just a teenager, here to buy a gift for her mother, and now she was being treated like a criminal. In the background, the whispers grew louder, and Mia noticed a man with a stern face pull out his phone to record what was happening. She wanted to cry, to shout, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. As the tension grew unbearable, a heavy hand landed on Mia's shoulder, making her jump. She looked up into the face of a tall, stern-looking man in a police uniform. His expression was unreadable, but his posture conveyed authority, and it was clear he was here for one purpose. Officer Darren O'Malley. He introduced himself, not even bothering to make eye contact with Mia as he addressed Mrs. Hampton. What seems to be the problem? This young lady, Mrs. Hampton began, her tone dripping with indignation, has been acting suspiciously. She's been touching multiple pieces of jewelry and has refused to comply with our request to empty her pockets. Mia's throat tightened and she felt a wave of nausea. She wanted to explain, to tell the officer what had really happened, but before she could open her mouth, Officer O'Malley gave her a hard, unyielding stare. "I'll need you to turn out your pockets, miss," he said, his voice void of empathy or understanding. "I didn't take anything." Mia insisted, her voice barely audible over the hammering of her heart. She looked around, desperate for support, but all she saw were judgmental eyes and curious faces. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let me call my dad." "He's—" Officer O'Malley raised a hand to silence her, his face unmoved. "You can make all the calls you want down at the station," he said firmly, reaching out to take her by the arm. "Now, if you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to detain you." Tears welled up in Mia's eyes as she tried to hold back her fear. How had this gone so wrong so quickly? She was only here to buy a gift, and now she was being treated like a common thief. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the quiet murmurs, and judgment as her heart raced. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Just as Officer O'Malley began to pull her toward the door, a powerful voice cut through the silence. "What in the world is going on here?" The crowd parted, revealing a tall, imposing figure with a stern expression and an undeniable air of authority. It was her father, Marcus Collins. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in Mia's tear-streaked face, Officer O'Malley's tight grip on her arm, and Mrs. Hampton's smug expression. His face hardened as he realized the gravity of the situation. "Dad," Mia managed, her voice breaking. Marcus wasted no time. He strode forward, his gaze locked on Officer O'Malley, and held up his badge. "I'm Marcus Collins, FBI. I demand an explanation." The room fell silent as everyone watched, stunned. Maya felt her father's hand on her shoulder, and in that moment she knew she was safe. But the battle was far from over, and Marcus was ready to fight for his daughter, no matter what it took. Marcus Collins enters the scene. Marcus Collins hadn't planned to leave work early, but when he received Mia's frantic text message, his heart skipped a beat. "Dad, please, I'm at Lansbury Jewelers. They think I stole something. Help." Those words hit him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. He immediately left his office, his mind racing, every instinct he had as a father and an FBI agent kicking in. The city streets blurred past him as he drove, his mind flipping through scenarios, each one worse than the last. He'd always told Mia that she could rely on him, that he would be there for her whenever she needed. He had kept that promise through countless scraped knees, late-night talks, and difficult school projects. But this was different. This was a situation he'd never imagined, and he wasn't about to let anyone treat his daughter unfairly. By the time he pulled up outside the jewelry store, he could already see a crowd gathering near the entrance, peering through the glass walls with morbid curiosity. His gaze found Mia almost immediately. She stood just inside the store, her head bowed, her shoulders tense, and her face streaked with the remnants of tears. Officer Darren O'Malley's hand rested firmly on her arm, an image that sent a surge of fury through Marcus's veins. Without a second thought, Marcus entered the store, his footsteps purposeful and unyielding. "What in the world is going on here?" he demanded, his voice a low, steely rumble that sliced through the hushed murmurs of the crowd. The store fell silent. Officer O'Malley's head jerked up, his gaze locking with Marcus's. In that instant, there was a silent exchange, a battle of authority, of power, and of sheer will. O'Malley straightened, his grip on Mia loosening slightly as he sized up the new arrival. Meanwhile, Marcus placed a firm hand on Mia's shoulder, grounding her, letting her know that he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere. "Dad." Mia's voice wavered, a mix of relief and residual fear. She clung to his presence, drawing strength from the calm yet fierce energy he radiated. "Mr. Collins, I presume," Officer O'Malley said, his tone guarded. He wasn't used to being questioned, and it showed in the slight tension around his jaw. "Agent Collins," Marcus corrected, his voice carrying a calm authority. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Now, someone had better tell me why my daughter is being detained without evidence." Before O'Malley could respond, Mrs. Hampton, the store owner, interjected, crossing her arms with a smug expression. "This young lady," she began, her voice cold and sharp, "was acting suspiciously from the moment she entered. I've dealt with enough situations to know when someone is up to no good. And when I asked her to empty her pockets, she refused." Marcus turned his gaze on Mrs. Hampton, his expression unreadable. "Acting suspiciously," he echoed, his voice steady. "Do you often accuse your customers of theft based on how they look?" Mrs. Hampton's face flushed slightly, but she held her ground, her eyes flitting nervously between Marcus and Officer O'Malley. "This isn't about looks," she replied defensively. "It's about behavior." She was touching the displays, lingering near high-value items, and then became defensive when asked to cooperate. Marcus felt a pang of anger, but he maintained his composure. "My daughter has every right to browse in your store without being harassed," he replied calmly. "Now, if you have actual evidence, anything on camera, perhaps, then produce it. Otherwise, I'm taking Mia home." Officer O'Malley cleared his throat, stepping in as if to assert his presence. "Agent Collins, with all due respect, we were simply conducting a standard protocol." Mrs. Hampton here expressed her concerns, and as an officer, it's my job to follow up on reports from citizens. We have a right to investigate suspicious activity. Marcus's eyes flicked over to the officer, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Suspicious activity," he repeated, his voice carrying an edge. "From what I understand, you were about to take my daughter to the station based on hearsay and an assumption. She's barely 18, and you're treating her like a criminal without probable cause. And as far as I know, Officer O'Malley, in this country, we're innocent until proven guilty." There was a quiet yet intense shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Hampton's bravado wavered slightly, while Officer O'Malley's jaw tightened, his authority being challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. He took a step back, but his gaze remained hostile. "Mr. Collins," he said, his voice clipped, "you're free to take this up with the precinct if you have any issues with the procedure here. But I assure you, we're only acting in the interest of law and order." Marcus's lips formed a hard line. His jaw clenched as he resisted the urge to lash out. He knew better than to escalate the situation further. Instead, he took a calming breath and reached into his pocket, producing his own badge with a swift, deliberate motion. He held it up, letting it catch the light, and met Officer O'Malley's gaze with unwavering intensity. "Then let's be clear about something," he said, his voice low and commanding. "I'm Marcus Collins, FBI Special Agent, and I know precisely what constitutes probable cause and due process. If you and Mrs. Hampton are so convinced that Maya stole something, I suggest you check the security footage. Otherwise, release her immediately, or I'll ensure that this incident reaches every outlet and higher authority necessary to get justice for my daughter." For a moment, the officer's face froze. Marcus could see the indecision flicker in his eyes, the subtle war between pride and caution. O'Malley glanced over at Mrs. Hampton, who had turned an alarming shade of red and was now visibly uncomfortable under the weight of Marcus's unwavering gaze. Realizing he was cornered, Officer O'Malley took a step back and reached for his radio, signaling to another officer outside the store. We'll get the footage," he muttered, clearly reluctant but unwilling to challenge Marcus further. Standard protocol. Mrs. Hampton, now visibly flustered, attempted to salvage some dignity. "It's just a misunderstanding," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "Let's be reasonable about this." Marcus didn't respond to her. His focus remained on Mia, his hand gently squeezing her shoulder. He could feel the tremble in her body, the residual fear she'd been holding in since this ordeal began. He wished he could have shielded her from every accusation, every harsh glance, but he knew that sometimes the world was unforgiving in ways that even a father couldn't prevent. The footage review took several minutes, with Officer O'Malley and Mrs. Hampton nervously hovering over the monitor as they rewound the store's security feed. Marcus stood nearby with Mia, his arms folded, his gaze never leaving the pair. He felt a surge of pride when he looked at Mia, her face still streaked with the remnants of tears, but her expression determined, her posture upright. She was his daughter through and through, resilient, strong, and brave. Finally, Officer O'Malley and Mrs. Hampton exchanged a tense look, and Mrs. Hampton sighed in resignation. She turned toward Marcus, her face a mask of forced politeness. "We didn't find anything out of place," she admitted, her voice tight. "It seems I may have been mistaken." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying. "Mistaken?" he repeated coldly. "You put my daughter through this ordeal, publicly humiliated her, treated her like a criminal, based on nothing more than a feeling, a suspicion." Mrs. Hampton's face flushed, and she fidgeted, her hands wringing together as she avoided his gaze. I apologize," she managed, though the words came out forced and hollow. Marcus turned to Officer O'Malley, his expression unyielding. "And you, officer, next time, perhaps you should consider gathering actual evidence before detaining an innocent person. This entire situation could have been avoided if you'd exercised even an ounce of discretion." O'Malley stiffened, clearly not accustomed to being chastised, especially not in front of a crowd. But Marcus could see the guilt in his eyes, the realization of how easily his judgment had been swayed by Mrs. Hampton's assumptions. Without another word, Marcus placed a protective arm around Mia and guided her out of the store. The crowd that had gathered watched them leave in silence, their whispers now subdued, their judgment replaced by shame. Marcus didn't stop until they were outside, where the cool autumn air hit them both like a balm after the suffocating tension of the jewelry store. Once they were clear of the building, Marcus turned to Mia, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice full of concern. Mia nodded, but her face betrayed a deep hurt, a vulnerability that Marcus hadn't seen in her in years. I don't understand, Dad," she whispered. "I was only trying to buy something nice for Mom. How did it turn into that?" Marcus took a steadying breath, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. "I don't have all the answers, Mia," he replied, his voice thick. "But I promise you this, I will get to the bottom of it. This isn't over." As they walked to the car, Marcus's mind was already working, piecing together the details, the implications, and the questions that still lingered. He'd seen enough to know when something wasn't right, and his instincts told him there was more to this situation than met the eye. And as an FBI agent, and more importantly, as a father, he was prepared to do whatever it took to uncover the truth and protect his daughter. Digging deeper. Back at home, the house was quiet, but the silence did little to calm the storm raging inside Marcus Collins. The confrontation at the jewelry store played over and over in his mind, each detail sharper, each expression and word from Officer O'Malley and Mrs. Hampton replayed with meticulous clarity. He had always trusted his instincts, and today, those instincts were screaming that something far deeper and more insidious lay beneath the surface. In the living room, Mia sat curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her as she stared vacantly at the floor. She was drained, her usual spark dulled, her hands fidgeting unconsciously as she processed what had happened. Marcus could see the pain, the disbelief, and the simmering anger in her eyes, and it tore at him. His daughter had experienced something no young woman should have to endure, and he knew that the wound went far beyond mere embarrassment. "Dad, I just don't get it," Maya finally whispered, her voice shaky. "Why would she accuse me like that? I didn't even do anything wrong. I just wanted to find something nice for Mom." Marcus sat down beside her, pulling her close, his arm a steady, reassuring presence. "Sometimes people let their prejudices cloud their judgment," he said gently. "But what happened today was more than just prejudice. It was deliberate. And I'm going to find out why." Mia looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Marcus replied, his tone unwavering. "I won't let this go, Mia. No one has the right to treat you like that." He gave her a reassuring squeeze before rising and heading to his study, a determined glint in his eyes. He sat down at his desk, his FBI-issued laptop glowing to life, as he began his search. First, he pulled up information on Officer Darren O'Malley. As the data filled his screen, Marcus's jaw clenched. It didn't take long to uncover complaints against O'Malley, complaints that seemed to suggest a pattern of behavior. O'Malley had been the subject of multiple internal investigations, though most were dismissed with warnings or minimal disciplinary action. Accusations of racial profiling and intimidation lingered on his record like an unswept stain, though none of the complaints had escalated to anything serious, thanks to a convenient lack of substantial evidence. But as Marcus scanned the details, he recognized a pattern in the dates and locations of the complaints. Each one originated from incidents in predominantly minority neighborhoods or businesses frequented by diverse clientele. A sinking feeling settled in Marcus's stomach. It seemed that O'Malley had a history of abusing his position under the guise of maintaining order. The longer Marcus examined O'Malley's record, the clearer it became that the officer had been operating with an unsettling amount of freedom. Each time a complaint had been filed, it seemed to vanish into the bureaucracy, quietly and without consequence. Marcus had seen cases like this before, people in positions of authority hiding behind layers of protocol and procedure, shielded by a system that allowed them to act with impunity. But it wasn't just O'Malley's record that troubled Marcus. His thoughts drifted back to Mrs. Hampton, the jewelry store owner. Her cold, accusatory gaze, her eagerness to assume Mia was guilty. Those were not the actions of someone with a simple misunderstanding. She had seemed intent on making an example of Mia, and that level of aggression spoke to a more profound prejudice. Deciding to take a closer look, Marcus quickly conducted a search on Lansbury Jewelers and its owner, Mrs. Eleanor Hampton. He skimmed through business records, client reviews, and local news articles, hoping to find something that might give him insight into her motivations. It didn't take long for him to come across a series of complaints from former customers. Many of the reviews painted a troubling picture. Mrs. Hampton was known for her high standards, but there were repeated accounts of customers, often people of color, being treated with an unusual level of scrutiny and suspicion. One review mentioned a young man who had been followed around the store until he felt compelled to leave, while another described a woman being asked to show her ID before handling certain pieces of jewelry. Marcus felt his anger reignite as he read through the stories, each one confirming his suspicions. Mrs. Hampton's behavior was far from a one-time incident. It was part of a pattern that had likely persisted due to a lack of accountability. The jewelry store owner and Officer O'Malley had both hidden behind their positions, confident in the power their roles afforded them to act as judge and jury over those they deemed suspicious. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, and the image they formed was disturbing. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with the implications. This wasn't just about Mia. This was about a culture of unchecked prejudice and abuse of authority. But Marcus knew that if he wanted to confront them, he needed more than suspicions. He needed hard evidence. He reached for his phone and dialed a number, waiting as it rang on the other end. "Hello," the voice answered, and Marcus recognized it as John, a former colleague and now a detective with the local precinct. "John, it's Marcus Collins," he replied, keeping his tone casual. "I need a favor." "Anything for you, Marcus," John replied. "What's going on?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm looking into an incident involving my daughter and a certain Officer O'Malley. I've come across some things in his file that concern me. I was wondering if you could dig a little deeper, find out if there's anything unofficial that might have slipped through the cracks." There was a moment of silence on the other end before John responded. "O'Malley, I've heard rumors about him, Marcus, but nothing's ever stuck. He's got connections, people who keep him covered. I'll see what I can find, but be careful. He's got friends in high places, and they don't take kindly to people poking around." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I understand. Thanks, John." As he hung up, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had dealt with men like O'Malley before, officers who operated with a veneer of righteousness, using their positions as weapons to target those they considered beneath them. But he wasn't about to let that happen to his daughter, or to anyone else if he could help it. A soft knock on his door broke his train of thought, and Mia appeared in the doorway, looking hesitant. "Dad?" she asked, her voice soft. Are you still looking into what happened?" Marcus smiled, motioning for her to sit. "Always, sweetheart. I'm just trying to make sense of what we're dealing with." Mia sat down across from him, her expression serious. "There was something else that I didn't mention," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "While I was in the store, there was a woman. She kept watching me. I didn't think much of it at first, but then she started whispering to the other employees, pointing at me. It was like she was trying to get them to think I was doing something wrong." Marcus's brow furrowed as he processed this new information. "Did you recognize her?" Mia shook her head. "No, but she seemed close to Mrs. Hampton. They were both watching me. It was like they were looking for a reason to get rid of me." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze intense. "That's important, Mia. If there was someone else involved, someone feeding Mrs. Hampton these suspicions, then this could be bigger than just one person's prejudice." Mia nodded, her expression uncertain. "I just don't understand why they would target me like that. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, honey," Marcus replied, his voice softening. "Sometimes people don't need a reason. They see what they want to see, but that doesn't make it right, and I won't let them get away with it." As they sat in the dim light of the study, father and daughter shared a moment of understanding. Marcus knew that this was more than just a case now. It was a personal mission, a fight not only for justice, but for Mia's sense of safety and dignity. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his study, Marcus formulated a plan. He would visit the jewelry store again, this time not as a protective father, but as an investigator. He would request access to their security footage, scrutinize every detail, and find out if there was more to Mrs. Hampton's motives than mere prejudice. He also planned to dig deeper into the people around her, especially the woman Mia mentioned. And if his instincts were right, he'd uncover something that would finally hold both Mrs. Hampton and Officer O'Malley accountable. With a sense of determination, Marcus closed his laptop and glanced at the family photo on his desk, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. Whatever it took, he would make sure that those responsible for hurting his daughter faced justice. This was only the beginning. The showdown. The next day, Marcus returned to Lansbury Jewelers, but this time, his approach was methodical. He had spent the previous night reviewing the limited information he'd gathered and speaking with a few trusted colleagues about Lansbury Jewelers' reputation in the community. The pieces weren't fitting neatly together yet, but he had enough to suspect that Mrs. Hampton and Officer O'Malley were involved in something deeper and more deliberate. As he entered the store, the luxurious setting that had once captivated his daughter now seemed tainted by the events of the previous day. Mrs. Hampton was behind the counter, her back turned as she rearranged a display of necklaces. The few customers inside the store cast brief glances at Marcus as he strode purposefully toward the counter. Mrs. Hampton's shoulders tensed when she turned around and saw him. "Agent Collins," she greeted, her voice devoid of the warmth she usually displayed for customers. Her expression was tight, and her eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "What can I do for you?" "Mrs. Hampton, we need to have a serious conversation," Marcus replied, his tone professional but edged with a firmness that left no room for pleasantries. Mrs. Hampton's eyes flicked to the side, noticing that they were drawing attention from a few nearby customers. With a forced smile, she gestured toward the back of the store. "Perhaps we can speak in private." Marcus followed her through a door leading to a small office, where a cluttered desk sat against one wall, and a large monitor displayed live security feeds from around the store. Mrs. Hampton closed the door behind them, and the two stood in tense silence before Marcus spoke. "I've reviewed the incident with my daughter, and I've also taken a closer look at your business practices, Mrs. Hampton," he began, his gaze unwavering. "It seems that my daughter wasn't the first person you've unfairly accused. There's a troubling pattern here, customers of color being singled out, treated with suspicion, and harassed without cause. Care to explain?" Mrs. Hampton's face hardened, but she forced a tight smile. "I run a respectable business, Agent Collins. I take precautions to protect my inventory and my employees. Sometimes that requires a bit of discretion." "Discretion?" Marcus's voice held an edge of disbelief. "I'd call it something else. It seems like you're using your position to target people based on prejudice, Mrs. Hampton. That's not discretion. It's discrimination." Mrs. Hampton's mask of politeness slipped, replaced by a look of cold irritation. "I don't appreciate your accusations, Agent Collins. I did what I thought was necessary to protect my store. Your daughter behaved suspiciously. I merely followed my instinct." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "And Officer O'Malley, how does he fit into all of this? Because it seems he's all too willing to act on these so-called instincts of yours without evidence." For a moment, Mrs. Hampton looked taken aback. She quickly recovered, though, a flicker of something resembling fear crossing her face. "I don't control what Officer O'Malley does, Agent Collins. He responded to my call, and I appreciate his diligence." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You and I both know it's more than that, Mrs. Hampton. I've seen his record, and I've spoken with people in this community. This isn't about protecting your store. This is about profiling people you deem undesirable for no reason other than your own biases, and Officer O'Malley seems more than happy to play along." Mrs. Hampton's face grew pale, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flash of genuine fear in her eyes. But before she could respond, the door to the office swung open, and Officer Darren O'Malley strode in, his face set in a grim expression. "Agent Collins," he greeted with a barely concealed sneer. "Didn't expect to see you back here so soon. I thought we resolved this little misunderstanding yesterday." Marcus turned to face him, his expression calm but cold. "Officer O'Malley, good timing. I was just having a discussion with Mrs. Hampton about her business practices and your involvement in her accusations against my daughter." O'Malley crossed his arms, his posture defiant. "Your daughter was acting suspiciously. Mrs. Hampton had every right to call me. and I was doing my job. Maybe if you taught her to respect authority, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Marcus's hands clenched at his sides, but he refused to let O'Malley goad him. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice low and unwavering. "Respect for authority doesn't mean blind submission to abuse of power, officer. My daughter has nothing but respect for the law, but that doesn't give you or Mrs. Hampton the right to humiliate and harass her. I've spoken with others who have dealt with you, and I know this isn't an isolated incident." O'Malley's face reddened, and he shot a glance at Mrs. Hampton, who was visibly uncomfortable. She looked away, pretending to organize paperwork on her desk. "Watch your tone, Agent Collins," O'Malley said, his voice thick with barely contained anger. "I don't take kindly to people accusing me of misconduct. I protect this community, and sometimes that means making tough calls. Maybe your daughter just needed a reminder of where she fits in." The implication in O'Malley's words sent a surge of anger through Marcus, but he took a steadying breath, keeping his voice level. "This community doesn't need protection from innocent people, officer. What it needs is protection from officers who use their badge to serve their own prejudices." O'Malley smirked, crossing his arms. "Well, if you have a problem, you know where to file a complaint, Agent Collins, but don't expect it to go anywhere." Marcus looked him dead in the eye, his expression unflinching. "Oh, I intend to do more than file a complaint. I'm going to make sure your actions come to light. You and Mrs. Hampton have been operating under the assumption that no one will question you, but that ends now." O'Malley's smug expression faltered for a moment, and Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. It was enough to tell him that the officer knew he was skating on thin ice. "Is that a threat?" O'Malley asked, his voice tinged with defensiveness. Marcus smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Consider it a promise. I've already contacted the Internal Affairs Division, and I'll be filing a formal report. I'll also be reaching out to the local media to ensure that everyone knows exactly how Lansbury Jewelers and its favored officer handle their customers." At that, Mrs. Hampton's face grew ashen, and she looked to O'Malley, her eyes wide with panic. The potential fallout from this was clearly dawning on her, and Marcus could see her calculating her next move, her confidence shaken. "Now hold on a minute," Mrs. Hampton stammered, her tone shifting from defiant to pleading. "Agent Collins, there's no need to involve the media. Perhaps we can come to an understanding." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "An understanding? My understanding, Mrs. Hampton, is that you and Officer O'Malley have abused your positions to target innocent people. And as an FBI agent, it's my duty to make sure that people like you are held accountable." Mrs. Hampton swallowed, casting a nervous glance at O'Malley, whose face was growing increasingly tense. It was clear that their alliance, which had once given them the power to act without consequence, was beginning to crumble under Marcus's scrutiny. Perhaps I overreacted," Mrs. Hampton muttered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe. I misjudged the situation with your daughter. I didn't mean to cause her any distress." Marcus held her gaze, unyielding. "Apologies are a start, Mrs. Hampton, but they won't undo the damage you caused. I want a formal public apology issued to my daughter and every other customer you've mistreated." Mrs. Hampton opened her mouth to protest, but O'Malley interrupted, his voice tight. "Don't be ridiculous, Agent Collins. You're blowing this out of proportion. This is all just some petty vendetta because you don't like how I do my job." Marcus turned his cold gaze to O'Malley, his voice low and laced with authority. "Officer, I know exactly how you do your job, and as of this moment, I'll be ensuring that everyone else knows as well. You're no longer dealing with someone who will look the other way." O'Malley shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time, Marcus saw genuine fear in his eyes. The officer's bravado was slipping, and he knew it. The power dynamic had shifted, and now he was the one being held accountable. Without another word, Marcus turned to leave, giving Mrs. Hampton and O'Malley one final look that spoke volumes. "I'll be watching, and I'll be in touch with both of your superiors. This isn't over." With that, he exited the office, his heart pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. As he left the store, he could feel the weight of the day's events settling on him, but he knew he was far from finished. He had won this battle, but there was still a war to fight. A war for justice, not just for Mia, but for everyone who had been wronged by people like Mrs. Hampton and Officer O'Malley. And he would see it through, no matter what it took. The revelation. After the tense confrontation at Lansbury Jewelers, Marcus Collins returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. He spent hours going over the recordings and notes he had made, but he knew he needed solid evidence to bring this case to light. It wasn't enough to suspect Officer O'Malley and Mrs. Hampton of prejudice and misconduct. He needed undeniable proof to expose their actions and make it impossible for anyone to dismiss his claims as mere overreaction. The next day, Marcus reached out to his colleague John, the local detective, hoping that he might have unearthed anything useful in O'Malley's file. To Marcus's surprise, John had something valuable. A tip about a potential witness who might be willing to speak out. Her name's Clara Thompson, John explained over the phone. She used to work as a sales associate at Lansbury Jewelers about a year ago. I remember she filed a harassment complaint against Mrs. Hampton, but nothing came of it. She might have some insight into how things work at that store. Thanks, John. I'll reach out to her, Marcus replied, feeling a glimmer of hope. Marcus didn't waste any time. He called Clara, explaining who he was and his connection to the incident involving his daughter. After a moment of hesitation, she agreed to meet him at a small cafe downtown. When he arrived, Marcus immediately recognized Clara from her nervous glances and the way she sat hunched over her coffee, looking as if she expected someone to reprimand her just for being there. Agent Collins, she greeted softly, her voice tinged with anxiety. I'm glad you reached out. I've wanted to say something for so long, but I didn't think anyone would listen. Marcus offered a reassuring smile. Thank you for meeting with me, Clara. Anything you can tell me will be helpful. I want to make sure that people like Mrs. Hampton and Officer O'Malley don't get away with this anymore. Clara nodded, taking a deep breath. It's a relief to finally talk to someone about this. Mrs. Hampton, she has this way of making you feel like you don't belong. I worked there for almost a year, and from the beginning, she'd make snide comments, subtle digs about me being too friendly with customers she didn't like. Clara paused, looking down at her hands as she fiddled with the edge of her sleeve. But it was more than that. She'd specifically watch customers of color, like she expected them to steal something the moment they walked in. She'd call them the usual suspects. Marcus's jaw tightened as he listened, his anger simmering just below the surface. Did you witness her take any actions against them? Clara nodded, her face paling slightly. She had a whole routine. She'd keep a record of suspicious customers, mostly people of color, and she'd encourage us to watch them closely, even if they were just browsing. She'd call Officer O'Malley whenever she thought someone looked sketchy. It was like they had this unspoken agreement. He'd show up, scare them off, and they'd never come back. And if someone protested, Mrs. Hampton would use that as proof they were guilty. Clara's hands trembled slightly, and Marcus could tell that speaking about this wasn't easy for her. I even tried to report it once, but Mrs. Hampton found out and made my life miserable until I finally quit. She told me she'd ruin my chances of getting another job if I said anything. Marcus nodded, his expression resolute. Thank you for telling me, Clara. This is exactly the kind of information I needed. Would you be willing to testify if we take this case further? Clara hesitated, but after a moment, she nodded. Yes, I don't want anyone else to go through what I did, or what your daughter did. It's not right. With Clara's statement, Marcus felt he had finally gained the leverage he needed. But he still needed concrete evidence that linked Officer O'Malley to Mrs. Hampton's routine, proof that would force the department and the public to confront the systemic issues that allowed their behavior to continue unchecked. Later that evening, Marcus received a call from John with another breakthrough. Marcus, John began, his voice barely containing his excitement. "You're going to want to hear this. I managed to pull some strings and get access to O'Malley's call logs for the last 2 years. Turns out there's a pattern, a very specific one." Marcus sat up, his heart pounding. "Go on." "O'Malley has been responding to calls from Lansbury Jewelers with suspicious frequency. We cross-referenced the dates with Mrs. Hampton's complaint records, and guess what? Nearly every incident involves a suspicious customer complaint from her, and every one of those complaints matches with someone who filed a racial profiling report after being confronted by O'Malley." John paused, letting the weight of the information sink in. "It's a coordinated effort, Marcus. Mrs. Hampton and O'Malley are targeting people, calling them in on fabricated complaints, and using intimidation to drive them out of the store. And thanks to Clara's testimony, we can confirm this isn't accidental. They'd been operating this way for years." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the smoking gun he needed, a clear, documented pattern that revealed a conspiracy between Mrs. Hampton and Officer O'Malley. Now he had everything he needed to take them down. The next day, Marcus met with the Internal Affairs Division, presenting them with the call logs, Clara's statement, and his own findings from his investigation. He laid out the case in detail, piece by piece, and watched as the weight of the evidence took hold. The officials listened intently, and Marcus could see the shift in their expressions as they realized the gravity of what he had uncovered. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention, Agent Collins," one of the investigators said, his voice grave. "We'll open a formal investigation into Officer O'Malley, and I'll make sure this reaches the chief. This is deeply troubling." But Marcus wasn't done yet. He had one more piece of the puzzle left to address: the public. That evening, Marcus sat down with a local journalist who had covered community stories for years, particularly issues of discrimination and abuse of authority. The journalist listened as Marcus recounted the events, showing her the documents, the testimony, and the evidence he had gathered. She was visibly shocked, and Marcus could see her mind racing as she processed the scope of the story. This could shake up the entire department," she said, her voice hushed but filled with determination. "Are you sure you're ready for this kind of fallout?" Marcus nodded. "If it means justice for my daughter, and for everyone else affected, then yes. This needs to come out. People deserve to know who's protecting them, and who's exploiting their power." The journalist agreed, promising to publish the story with full transparency and follow-up interviews. The article went live within days, and the response was immediate. It spread like wildfire, igniting public outrage and shining a harsh light on the practices at Lansbury Jewelers and Officer O'Malley's misconduct. The comments flooded in, each one a mix of shock, anger, and support for those who had been affected. Within hours, the story had gained traction, picked up by other media outlets, and shared widely across social media. Meanwhile, Marcus received word that Officer O'Malley had been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation, and Mrs. Hampton's business had become the subject of protests and calls for boycott. The store's reputation plummeted, and former employees and customers came forward with their own stories, each one reinforcing the truth Marcus had fought to reveal. At home, Maya watched the news coverage with a mix of relief and sadness. She felt vindicated, but she also knew that what she had gone through was only one part of a much larger problem. Marcus sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, offering silent support as they watched the community rally around them. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." Marcus looked at her, pride and love filling his gaze. "You don't have to thank me, Mia. I'm your father, and I'll always stand up for what's right. For you, and for anyone who needs it." In that moment, as they sat together amidst the fallout of their hard-fought battle, Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had exposed a truth that others had ignored, bringing justice to his daughter, and setting a precedent that would resonate far beyond their own experience. And he knew, as long as he could, he would continue to fight for justice, not just for his family, but for everyone who deserved it. justice served, and a new beginning. The days following the explosive article were a whirlwind of interviews, media appearances, and community reactions. Marcus watched as the truth he'd fought so hard to expose continued to ripple across the city. The public's response was swift and powerful. Officer O'Malley and Mrs. Hampton quickly became symbols of a broken system that allowed discrimination to go unchecked, and people weren't about to let them get away with it. Internal Affairs acted on Marcus's report within hours of the story going public. Officer O'Malley was not only suspended but put under official investigation for multiple counts of misconduct and abuse of authority. The department announced that his actions were under review by an external oversight committee, a significant step that showed the gravity of the accusations. The committee planned to thoroughly audit every case O'Malley had been involved in, uncovering a disturbing pattern of selective enforcement and profiling that had been swept under the rug for years. As for Mrs. Hampton, her once thriving jewelry business suffered an immediate backlash. The protests outside Lansbury Jewelers grew daily, with community members calling for accountability. Signs reading "End Discrimination" and "Justice for Mia" lined the sidewalk, and even those who had once been loyal customers turned away, refusing to support a business built on exclusion and prejudice. Former employees, encouraged by Clara's bravery, began sharing their own stories of mistreatment and manipulation at Mrs. Hampton's hands. The collected voices became impossible to ignore, and after only a week, Mrs. Hampton closed the store indefinitely. On the legal front, Clara's testimony, alongside Marcus's meticulous documentation, paved the way for formal charges against both Officer O'Malley and Mrs. Hampton. Civil rights lawyers approached Marcus and Clara, eager to help bring a civil suit on behalf of the affected customers, not only for restitution, but as a catalyst for policy reform. Marcus agreed, knowing that this fight wasn't just about winning damages, it was about setting a precedent and pushing for change that would prevent similar abuses in the future. The court case quickly gained national attention, and soon the whole country was watching as the stories of Mia, Clara, and countless others were brought into the spotlight. O'Malley's defenders, initially supportive, began to distance themselves as the extent of his misconduct came to light. The department faced pressure to introduce reforms, and community leaders demanded accountability not only from individual officers, but from the entire system that had allowed these abuses to occur. For Marcus, the personal toll of the fight had been heavy, but he was unwavering in his resolve. As he prepared to testify, he couldn't help but reflect on how this journey had begun with one traumatic experience for his daughter, a single act of prejudice that had shaken his family. But now, that moment of pain had turned into a movement, a force for change that was already making a difference. The night before he was scheduled to testify, Marcus sat down with Mia, who was stronger and more resilient than he'd ever seen her. Despite everything she had endured, she had emerged with a new sense of confidence, her voice unwavering as she shared her story with the media, inspiring others to come forward. "I'm proud of you, Mia," Marcus said, his voice filled with emotion. "I know this hasn't been easy, but you've shown so much strength through all of this." Mia looked at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to talk about it, Dad. But seeing how much of a difference it's making, it feels like it was worth it." Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "You've made a difference, sweetheart. We both have. And it's because of you that so many people are finally speaking up." The next morning, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as Marcus took the stand. Reporters, community leaders, and the families of those affected filled the seats, their eyes trained on him as he recounted the events of the day at Lansbury Jewelers, each detail a reminder of the prejudice his daughter had faced. He spoke clearly, each word measured, his voice steady but firm, as he outlined the evidence he had gathered and the impact it had on his family. When it was Clara's turn, she delivered her testimony with quiet strength. She detailed the systemic discrimination she had witnessed at the jewelry store, the pattern of profiling and the agreement between Mrs. Hampton and Officer O'Malley to target and intimidate certain customers. Her courage moved many in the audience, who had seen her as an unlikely hero in a story that had grown far beyond what anyone had expected. Throughout the proceedings, the weight of the evidence made it clear that neither Officer O'Malley nor Mrs. Hampton would escape the consequences of their actions. O'Malley's position within the department was officially terminated, and Mrs. Hampton faced heavy fines and was barred from operating her business in the city. Both faced civil suits that promised to secure compensation for those they had wronged, and Marcus felt a deep sense of closure as the verdict was finally announced. The courtroom erupted in applause, the atmosphere electric with relief and triumph. Marcus embraced Mia, their victory more than just a personal one. It was a win for everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed by people like Mrs. Hampton and Officer O'Malley. They had taken a stand, and their courage had sparked change in ways neither of them had anticipated. In the following weeks, Marcus's life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but he knew things had forever changed. Community groups reached out to him, inviting him to speak at events advocating for law enforcement reform and equality. His work had always been about justice, but now it had become a personal mission, a cause that meant more than ever. Mia, too, found her voice in unexpected ways. Inspired by her experience, she joined a youth-led organization focused on combating discrimination and promoting diversity in schools and communities. She became a leader, organizing events and speaking about her journey, determined to create a world where others wouldn't have to endure what she had. Her resilience inspired many, and her story became a rallying cry for young people across the city, igniting a new wave of awareness and activism. One sunny afternoon, Mia invited Marcus to an event she had organized at her school, a forum for students to discuss their experiences and ideas on promoting inclusion. As he sat in the audience, watching her address the crowd with a confidence that had been born from struggle and hardship, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of pride. After her speech, Mia joined him, her eyes bright with purpose. "Thanks for everything, Dad," she said, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "I don't know where I'd be if you hadn't fought for me." Marcus wrapped his arm around her, his heart full. "You would have found your way, Mia. You're stronger than you know." They stood together, father and daughter, gazing out at the students who had gathered to listen, learn, and grow. Marcus knew that this was just the beginning for Mia, that she would continue to make a difference in ways that even he couldn't predict. Their journey had started with pain and injustice, but it had led them to something far greater. Together, they had faced down prejudice, exposed the truth, and sparked change. And as they walked away from the event, surrounded by the hopeful energy of a new generation, Marcus felt at peace, knowing that they had turned adversity into an enduring legacy of strength, courage, and compassion.